We're very excited to welcome our Open Data in the States and Municipalities session that'll begin in a couple of minutes as people filter back from the exhibition hall. Now, in some ways, the progress of open data has moved faster on the state level and the municipal level because states and municipalities are smaller than the federal government. In other senses, there are more barriers because they're less resourced. But as Cornelia Chebinou of the National Association of State Auditors, Comptrollers, and Treasurers will describe, there are some interesting overlaps, especially the ways in which the passage of the Data Act might create an ecosystem that can help state and local governments, that might allow state and local governments to automate more than they're already automating, might overflow into other areas of reporting that technically the Data Act doesn't even touch. Is that mysterious enough for you? Maybe it is. We are grateful for all of our partner sponsors' support, and we're particularly grateful right now for the support of our partner sponsor, StreamLink Software. And I'd like to invite the CEO of StreamLink, Adam Roth, to the podium to moderate. Please welcome everyone.
Thanks, Hudson. I'm not actually allowed to say this, but I'm going to quote Hudson. Hudson Hollister refers to us as the TurboTax for grants management software with our Amplifund product. And he has said it, so it's an honest quote. We're excited to be here, excited to be part of this conference. We started a process as we looked at the federal government and open data when we started working with a project with the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board a couple years ago called the GRIP project, where we had a focus of standardizing financial data reports across 25 different agencies to 9 recipients, rolling that data back up to the federal government and presenting it sort of in a dashboard format. Amplifund focuses both on the financial performance as well as the programmatic performance when we look at grants management. Amplifund is our key product. Amplifund Federal focuses on the federal life cycle and recipient reporting, both performance and financial. And we are excited to work with federal partners like KPMG and CGI Federal, who are represented here today. Amplifund traditionally has focused on recipients to help state and local governments manage the financial and programmatic reporting burdens that they have both to the federal government as well as their independent audits. Our focus in this space has allowed us to work with tens of thousands of users managing billions of dollars in grants today. As we push forward through the Data Act, it is clear that local reporting and quality data coming from state and local governments, as well as other lead recipients and subrecipient data, both on the performance and the financial side, is going to be critical to being able to create federal transparency. Without good data coming into the system, the visualization of that data, the integration of that data is less powerful. We need the good data coming into the system. This is evidenced by a study that was recently conducted by Forrester, which is a well-known research firm. We actually have at our booth over here copies of how to access that study, the Data Act, one small step for data, one potentially giant step for accountability. This is a great study. It's great to see a third-party research firm take on this issue in the private sector and look at this issue and how it's going to affect life going forward. Because of this study and because of the importance of state and local government's impact, I'm very excited to moderate this panel. This panel focuses on state and local government initiatives. If these initiatives are successful, this will help dramatically the implementation of a federal data act and the ability of that federal data act to be successful in creating good transparency data going forward. And with that, I'm going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves. You do have a short description of each, but we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to shift from announcement and pitch to moderator. So in that sense, I'm going to turn this quickly over to Ari to get started, and we're going to ask each panelist to give a brief introduction.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. You know the saying, all politics is local, and I think to a large extent all transparency is local. When we reflect on what taxpayers find to be meaningful data, I doubt that agency budgets, DOE, HHS, DOD, and the list goes on, is a meaningful piece of data or information for folks. I'm from New York. New York City receives about $6 billion a year from the federal government. The state of New York receives about $50 billion a year from the federal government. If the Data Act can help show folks what the federal government does in their neighborhoods and their communities, then it suddenly becomes meaningful. So I think the state and local piece is really important here. A quick word or two on my background. I currently serve as a senior advisor at Socrata, where I work on with state and local governments on financial transparency. And I previously had the privilege of serving as the Deputy Comptroller of New York City, where I spearheaded the Big Apple's financial transparency initiatives. And for those of you who have laptops on you, you could check us out at checkbooknyc.com. That's the financial transparency suite of applications that we built to help track our $70 billion budget. It includes the most granular data possible on revenues, contracts, spending, payroll, and budget. And we really chose to invest so heavily in Checkbook NYC because we felt that fundamentally it was government's responsibility not only to place data in the public domain, but also to make it accessible to folks. So if you have the skill set to track your own spending online with Citibank, Chase, or perhaps someone else, the goal of Checkbook NYC is that the same ease of use would apply there. So I'm delighted to be on this panel, and I'll turn it over to the representative from Ohio.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Duffey, State Representative in the Ohio House of Representatives in my 4th year in the legislature in Ohio. You know, for us, it started a little bit with a crisis in that when Governor Kasich was elected in 2010, we were facing at that time projected $7.7 billion shortfall, and that was the year that I was elected to the legislature as well. Being a clean sweep across the board Republican state as we are right now in Ohio, even though we're a purple state by voter registration, the idea of raising taxes to solve that gap wasn't really acceptable, and so we ended up having the unpleasant task of doling out scarce resources, which meant reductions in spending all across the state of Ohio, which we naturally took a lot of criticism for. And to defend those decisions, it's very difficult to do. We want to have the data to be able to back up what we're trying to do. And we want to be able to illustrate in as clear a way that people can understand as possible. One of the things that we had to do was reduce the local government fund by $390 million. Is that a large cut? Is that a small cut? Is it an appropriate cut? It ended up being about 2.5% of the average municipality's budget, but it was a 50% cut in what the state had been providing historically. So is that big, 50%, or is it small because it's 2.5%? And is it wise because that was the least painful place to dole out that reduction or not? This is an article from the Columbus Dispatch just a couple days ago. It was old-fashioned, classic journalism, somebody slogging through paper, right, to find out what police spending is. And it says, police spending varies widely. The 5 most expensive cities, Bryce, $1,227 per resident on police spending, whereas the lowest, Commercial Point, spends $69. How is that possible? This is not the kind of data that ordinary citizens routinely have access to, and yet it's the kind of stuff that we crave in state government and that we hope you crave, people that are in the industry, and that citizen journalists and activists and people who want to make their community better crave. And so that really got us thinking about benchmarking, which led us to open data. Started having conversations with the Sunlight Foundation, starting looking at what other states had done. Kudos to New York, both at the state level and at the city level. You know, big cities are doing big things with big data and open data. But also Utah, New Hampshire, California to some extent, Hawaii, Colorado. Some of this stuff started organically, kind of non-governmentally. You know, it's activists that said, let's do it. And we're trying to piece all of that together. And so what we've got in Ohio right now is a 4-bill package. It basically is a convening board, the Data Ohio board. They set the standards, they do a discussion, shared governance model. No one person is in control. Second, uniform accounting for local governments in Ohio. That's a first time for us. We have it for schools. We don't have it for general government, townships, municipalities. Third is a one-point, dissemination stop. You've seen this in other states, data.whatever the state name is, .gov. We don't have it. We need to have that. And lastly, you've got to make the decision. Is this going to be a mandate like the Federal Data Act, or is it going to be a funded, incentivized program? And to be totally honest with you, and we'll get into this later, I think that we've had to take the latter approach in Ohio. So thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. First off, I would like to thank Hudson. I worked with Hudson when he still worked for Chairman Issa way back when and was actually responsible for the beginnings of the Data Act. So congratulations, Hudson, from the beginnings of the Data Act to now having this great coalition of folks working on transparency. My name is Cornelia Chebinou, and I represent the National Association of State Auditors, Comptrollers, and Treasurers. So we're the state finance folks, both elected and appointed across the United States and the U.S. territories. Much of what you heard from Jean applies as well to the state audit function, being able to corroborate the numbers, being able to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse from a controller standpoint, checking your internal controls and having some authority over the state agencies that receive federal funds. And so we've been involved for a very, very long time. A lot of our experiences come from the Recovery Act. We were front and center for the first time providing expenditure data out of the accounting systems at the state level. Unfortunately, it wasn't as easy as pushing a button, but our folks are financial people, and we're very interested in transparency and accountability, keeping the public trust, and if the public doesn't trust what the government is doing, very problematic for not only my members, but for governments as a whole. The largest percentage of grant funds either go through or to state and local governments. We're talking about 82% of those funds, so we have a big stake in what happens in setting these federal data standards. We've got many initiatives under the way. As you know, all 50 states have some sort of a transparency site, open checkbook. Some of them are pretty robust and good sites, and quite honestly, some of them are unsearchable and unusable. So we have a ways to go. I think in setting the federal standards, some of those lessons can be learned, and also some of the pitfalls perhaps avoided and some of the things that the states have done. I believe it's about 8 states now actually have some sort of either policy or law in place for open data, so we're moving gradually towards that, and I look forward to the panel going forward.
Thanks, Cornelia. It's a great frame-up of the conversation. One of the things that we've seen as from a business analyst perspective is that we're expecting well over 1,200 RFPs or requests for proposals from state and local government for grant services or grant management services. We expect a large majority of those to be relatively connected to systemization of grant process and the idea of moving data and collecting data in a more standardized format over the next 12 to 15 months. This is very much a significant increase in the focus and the commitment of state and local governments towards this. What are you hoping from your own perspective? How do you see communities? What are you hoping that open data can accomplish? What your vision? What do you see that from an accomplishment standpoint? Representative Duffey, we start with you, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think initially everyone focuses on the accountability aspect of it and the idea that government can become more efficient, and the classic maxim in Ohio was do more with less. Governor Voinovich, later U.S. Senator Voinovich, always used to say that ad nauseum. But I also want to extend it to the public trust. I mean, people just don't trust the federal government. They don't trust the state government. They really only trust their local government. And even then, I'm not sure how strong the trust is. So I think extension of trust is a huge potential upside to be able to open this data and to make it user-friendly and digestible for the average citizen, not just the people that are in this room who really are the elite of the elite in understanding these topics. And then the last thing is I think that there should be a data race, a full-fledged race among the various states, the various cities, to be the first to embrace this, because I think if you as a locality are welcoming of this, entrepreneurs and businesses are going to co-locate. Even though it is internet-based and largely online and you could be anywhere to do it, I think co-location still has a magnetic attraction, and I think that means job creation. I think that this is a very untapped resource. It could be as big as the internet itself. And that kind of job creation, that kind of efficiency is going to concentrate in a particular area. You could be like Wall Street is to New York. You could be like Silicon Valley is to California. And the question is, who is going to be, the next big data kind of open data epicenter?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of those comments. Certainly, wearing my state and local hat, I'm hopeful that the Data Act will provide local governments with some best practices in the area of data standards and publication that might be able to be leveraged on the local level. I know that when I began working on financial transparency for New York City, USAspending.gov was a source of inspiration. I know that it's not a perfect site and there are all sorts of problems with the data, but nonetheless, I think what the federal government does create innovation on a local level as well. But, let's face it, the bipartisan cooperation around the Data Act is the exception rather than the rule. And trust in government is at an all-time low. In fact, according to Pew Research, just 19% of Americans say they trust government to do what's right, and that's down from a high of 73% in 1958. When it comes to spending, a 2011 Gallup poll found that American taxpayers believe, get this, 51 cents on every dollar is wasted by the federal government. It's my hope that the Data Act ultimately answers the most basic questions taxpayers have, whether they're in Columbus, in New York City, or in Seattle, or wherever they are, which is, pardon my language here, what the blank does the federal government do with my money, right? And if the Data Act could answer that fundamental question, then the Data Act will be successful. We already know that the internet can be used as a tool to topple governments, right? There's been a lot of talk about that and a lot of articles about it. It's still an outstanding question in my mind. Can the internet be used as a tool to strengthen governments and to strengthen democracy? And that's what I'm hopeful the Data Act will do for the state and local level.
So I guess instead of talking about open data in general, there are lots of different uses, in particular for investors of municipal bond funds and putting information out there. But when you're talking about federal award information, at least what our members would like to see is auditors right now had used recovery.gov in their compliance testing for single audits, some auditors at least. A lot of auditors also conduct performance audits of federal programs. And so information that is reliable is very important for cooperation standpoint. Also for monitoring, as I mentioned, of subrecipients, but the information needs to be accurate. And also definitionally, the definition of data standards, one of the problems that we faced during Recovery Act is each agency would define expenditure a little bit differently, which makes it very hard for the people on the other end for reporting purposes. Auditors have to spend a lot of information confirming amount of grants coming from the various granting agencies. We would hope that Recovery Act, by providing some data standards and centralizing some of the information, would help us reconcile some of the discrepancies and also help with monitoring the subrecipients. And I think that was mentioned earlier as well, fraud, waste, and abuse, and the identification of improper payments is another important component of this information.
Okay. So just to kind of take some quick bullet points out of this, we have, elimination of fraud, waste, and abuse, a lot on extension of government and trust, stronger oversight, greater efficiency, building on best practices, strengthening democracy. This all sounds wonderful, yet I know each of you are pursuing individualized or have tried different initiatives in your communities, and I imagine it was not met with 100% support, or there were challenges that had to be overcome or processes that you had to think of. And so, Ari, I'm going to start with you with the checkbook program that you mentioned, primarily because it was brought up at the meeting on Friday, on the town hall meeting Friday. It was brought up as an example of an outstanding work that was completed in a community around transparency. So because you created this outstanding work, you get to lead us off. So appreciate that. Thanks.
Well, for purposes of full transparency, I'd like to say that our job in New York City, when we started putting the budget online and our spending online in early 2010, was a much, much easier task than most states and local governments, and certainly the federal government has. And just to share a historical anecdote of why that was. So New York City was in a fiscal crisis in the 1970s and was sort of on the verge of bankruptcy. And as an outcome of that process, and this sounds a little obscure, but it's relevant, there were all sorts of committees that gathered, and experts, financial experts, accounting experts, business experts, and one of the mandates out of that financial crisis was that New York City needed to have a centralized financial management accounting system. Not the sexiest thing to talk about in the world, but nonetheless, we were probably one of the first cities, if not the first city, to have a centralized accounting system. So when we got into office in 2010, and I served in an appointed role, we had what we called FMS, a financial management system, in its third iteration. It had evolved, obviously, since the 1970s, but every single agency that drew on our $70 billion budget was using the same platform. So it was really simple from a technological perspective, not from a cultural perspective, but from a technological perspective, to take that data, or at least a meaningful sliver of that data, and put it online. We saw a lot of interesting things with Checkbook. One of the most interesting things, at least from our perspective, was that the high usage rates, we sort of monitor the internet traffic, and I don't have specific stats, but the high usage rate of government employees in agencies across New York City. So we have a workforce of 300,000 employees, which is pretty much a top 10 workforce in the United States, and about 4,000 or so employees have access to the financial management system. But that leaves a lot of employees who don't have access to the financial data, and just because you have access to the system doesn't mean that you know how to look up information. So Checkbook NYC really started serving as a managerial dashboard of sorts for internal purposes in a way that we really didn't envision. I mean, we were very much a public-facing website aimed at taxpayers, journalists, academics, researchers, but when you embark upon one of these projects, it's really hard to know how things turn out. So just wanted to share those observations and lessons.
Thank you. Cornelia, you mentioned earlier that you had the that you thought most states had some transparency initiatives. Some of this you had mentioned to me earlier was driven by this report card process. Maybe you just kind of drive into that a little bit and give some sort of experiences.
So last year, for the first time, was that all 50 states actually have a transparency site. As I mentioned, some of them are pretty good and some of them not so good. But a lot of what's driving that is there's a public interest group, PIRG, Public Interest Research Group, I think it is, that issues a report card every year. And actually grades the states on their transparency sites and under a number of different actions, ease of use, information that's available, downloadable information in bulk, those sorts of things. And so each year they would grade the states, and you'd be surprised from a political standpoint when the governor sees that he has a D on the report card, how quickly they are to assign some resources to getting that checkbook site a little bit more up to date and a little better. So people are working for, I think there's about 10 states now that are actually graded at an A. And so there's work to be done. 3 states are still an F, and I won't mention who those are. But we're working towards more open data and better financial data, at least for the public to consume.
Thank you. And Representative Duffey, the initiative that I think is probably most front in your mind these days is the State of Ohio Open Data Initiative. And so we have kind of in terms of the examples, we have Ari, was focused on an internal local government initiative, starting out as a managerial process, rolling into a public consumption tool. Cornelia was talking about states trying to create this public consumption tool based on sort of national pressure. And what we're looking at in Ohio, I think, is more around the idea of trying to create legislation similar maybe, or maybe different from the Federal Data Act, so maybe we can kind of walk through that process
Yeah,
as well.
so as I was talking about it earlier during my opening remarks, I was saying that we started in 2011. You'd say, well, why haven't you passed a bill yet? It's 2014, 3 years later. And I'm wondering the same thing sometimes, but it can be very challenging to get it done. There are a lot of people that, first of all, government doesn't ask for this. You know, other people in state government don't say, can you please scrutinize me? Local municipalities aren't saying, can you please scrutinize me? So you have to build a coalition, and you know, we really started to gain steam after the Data Transparency Coalition was formed, and I found out that there were so many entities like yourself that are based in Ohio. We also have LexisNexis and Teradata that are both out of the Dayton region. Those are huge assets for us, and the reality is it's a very political process. You need people demanding this, or else politicians aren't going to get it done. One of the other obstacles to this is, other than the people in this room and the people that follow this issue nationally, who gets this? I mean, I'm a layperson, I'm not an auditor, I'm not a programmer, I'm not any of those things, and yet I get the palpable sense of where the value comes from, that people could, within 30 seconds, they should have access to that data, that they own it, that it's public record, that sunshine laws and freedom of information laws say, this is yours, you should have access to it. And yet they don't really have access to it right now. And yet it's just so difficult because there are people that stand to lose, people from the scrutiny, perhaps people that benefit from barriers to entry on the market right now because they've got the proprietary code and nobody else can get access to it, and breaking that off from government's difficult. The idea that you're going to usher in a new era that's not going to be that in terms of creating that habit for the way contracting is done across the state. A lot of people are scared about that. And I also think that what we're doing in Ohio, because it's beyond financial reporting, it's not just spending, it's harder for people to wrap their head around. What is all open data? You know, it's easy to start with spending, but the way that we try to think of value as a state is budgeting for outcomes. And so while we want to disclose spending, we also want to disclose outcomes. So things like tying the police officer data that I talked about on the spending per capita to crime rates in the community, to demographic data in the community is hugely important. And I think a lot of the effort nationally has been just on the dollar and cents and not on the return on the investment, the value. But the broader you get, the more entities you have that are resisting you, lobbyists for other, believe it or not, local government units have their own independent lobbyists, and they will fight this stuff. They will say, you know, it's good for somebody else, but not for us, exempt us out. And so kind of holding true to your principles, you have to move towards more permissive systems. And you also have to rely on people like you to build validation. The business community and the researchers and the thought leaders need to build validation with the governors of the states, with the speakers of the legislatures, with the Senate presidents to say that this isn't just something, it has real value and you should chase it.
So as we look at the conversation so far, we've talked a little bit about how local governments are looking at creating better and stronger systems, processes to display and visualize data, as well as systems to collect and have access to data as being critical to decision making, to management, to trust. As we look at all these processes that are taking place at the local government, we now have to turn our eyes as well to the federal government with the enactment of the Data Act, or the data law, as it was referred to earlier today. And as we look at that, it becomes really important then to figure out how do we intersect local practice, initiatives, policy with federal, because in order for this to work, as my opening remarks suggested, both pieces have to come together. The data that's being collected here in New York City, in the state of Ohio, or across all 50 states, has to be rolled up and has to come into the federal government. And so as we look at Data Act implementation at a federal level, what are some thought processes that you as the panel have in terms of key components or key expectations for the process in order for it to effectively work with local government? Cornelia?
I would just get back to that initial, there's really a need for outreach, particularly with the state and local governments, as we receive about 82% of those federal grant funds that either are to or flow through, as I mentioned earlier. And we're a little, I don't want to say skeptical, But this will apply to us eventually. A lot of the requirements right now are on the federal agencies, but the data standards apply to all grant recipients, and anything that's done at the federal level in terms of the money going to the states will affect us. So we would hope that we would be involved early in the process so that if there are going to be issues or reporting down the line, that we have our systems ready to go, that the interface exists, or that we can figure out a way for that information to flow.
Great.
And, you know, what I'd like to see is, and I haven't really seen this, is because adoption's so low with the number of states that are participating, I don't think people have even gotten to the point of saying, should there be at least some kind of convening discussion forum for states broadly? You know, is the federal government going to lead that role? Are the states going to lead that role? Obviously, with states' rights and local rights, people love to have something that's state-based for states, not the federal government telling us what to do. So, you know, I would hope that, you know, if Data Ohio goes and other open data policies across other states go, that the people who are the thought leaders or the program managers for those programs across the states start to informally or formally start to get together and talk about interoperability and how they can make the standards communicate with each other. But the number one thing is if we can get it machine readable and get it online, then we're going to be most of the way there, because we can roll up from there pretty easily, as previous speakers have talked about with mapping.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I agree with these comments. I think change is going to be incremental, and it's hard to figure out now what things are going to look like 5, 10 years down the line. Will the state of New York and the state of Ohio and other states voluntarily adopt some type of financial data standards to publish government data? Maybe. What should the role of the federal government be in doing that? That's a question mark. What I do hope is that the laser focus on the Data Act and implementing the Data Act and creating data standards will kind of heighten the awareness about the importance of financial transparency on a state and local level, and states and cities and counties and school districts will implement their own financial transparency solutions, and then down the road we'll kind of figure out how to ensure that we're all speaking the same language. But I don't think that's a task that we need to really worry about too much today. I think that's something that, you know, we'll reconvene here in 2020 and figure that out. Let's first get the data into the public domain. Let's be financially transparent, and we don't all need to speak exactly the same language just yet.
So that's it for my questions for today. These guys did an outstanding job. They were very fast in their responses, so it leaves us some time for audience questions as well. I think the concept of what the panel talked about today, though, I think is something that we'll have to carry with us as we go and think about how we apply the conversations that are happening at Treasury and OMB and how those things apply to the state and local governments, and also how is what's happening at state and local government applied to the processes that are being created here in the federal level as well. So with that, I'll open up for questions. Do we have any questions? Oh, right here. Hudson, to your right, or gentleman to your left.
Hi, my name is Jeff Myers. About 15 or 20 years ago, I did consulting with school districts in probably 20 or 30 different states and found most of the states had kind of real chaos. But interestingly, Oregon was different. And for every one of Oregon's approximately 50 school districts, they all had the same chart of accounts. They actually all had the same financial accounting software, in part perhaps because the state provided it. And what that made me very interested in was the benefits they got from it, which were very concrete, and I'll describe 2 or 3 of them to you. And my question is essentially, do benefits like that, are they things that you can see as you experience them, and how powerful a motivator are they? And so the 2 or 3 benefits I'll just use as an example for the state of Oregon is, of the 50 or 60 school districts in the state of Oregon, not one of them had to pay for a new accounting system because the state paid for it and gave it to them. And of those 50 or 60 school districts, every one of them could see how many meals per labor hour of school lunch lady time were being produced, so they could compare efficiency in school lunch programs. And of all those school districts, they could tell you what proportion of teacher time or certificated employee time was spent in front of classes versus in administration or curriculum development. So they could do all sorts of wonderful things about improving education, and primarily, again, because they had these data standards, although in their case it was, again, because the state paid for the system and mandated that they use it in the same chart of accounts. So my question is, are there particular sorts of, again, very concrete benefits or motivations that you've seen in your experience? And do you think those are powerful enough to cause either kind of broader standards within states or perhaps even across states?
Someone want to grab it? Okay, Mike.
Yeah, you know, when we initially started having the conversation in Ohio, it basically started with a guy named Gene Krebs, who had been a former legislator who worked for a think tank that was bipartisan called Greater Ohio. And he essentially was saying, if you can't measure it, how do you manage it? And he was demanding that we try to do a CUP report for local governments. And in Ohio, the CUP report is what everyone refers to as the school report. It's the district profile report. And it's made possible because 614 public school districts across Ohio have a uniform chart of accounts. And so we can pull vast amounts of data, and I have, and it's very useful, because constantly as a legislator, you're evaluating, well, how much are we as a district paying into the state fund, and how much do we get back, and what is the correlation with the results in terms of our students? And as debates occur about redistribution of money from wealthier districts to poorer districts, is that money resulting in better results? And none of that would be possible, really, if we didn't have standard accounting right now so that we could do those apples-to-apples comparisons. And so the CUP report, the school district uniformity of accounting, was the impetus for us to be able to say, if we're already doing it for schools, why aren't we applying it to local governments? And when you look across the 50 states, places like Georgia, I think it was 1997 that they passed, and it wasn't that controversial, uniform charts of accounts for pretty much every local government unit that they have across the state. And so I think there are states that are way ahead on uniform charts of accounts and being able to do those kinds of things, and the potential that opens for data inquiry, you know, not ideology, but data-driven decision-making. And then there are states that are way behind on it, and that was the driver for us.
I'll jump in here for a moment as well. You know, should cities and counties be able to leverage technological assets that exist on the state level? Of course. But it's also my opinion that transparency, financial transparency online needs to be made as the top priority. And when it comes to things like chart of accounts, which is basically data standards, or when it comes to things like shouldn't each of the X school districts use the same software as a cost-saving measure, and because of other benefits, that should come second. We really need to make online financial transparency the #1 priority, and if we don't, then things like chart of accounts and a unified system can keep us busy for the next 20 years.
Yep, up here. Yeah, here we go. Hudson, we're up here.
So, 2 questions. First, on checkbook disclosure of payroll information. So this discussion we've had at the federal level, one of the big black holes in the Data Act is individual level payroll information. And in most states that have checkbook disclosure, that's also a political non-starter. It's too risky, even though in, say, many school districts and counties, more than 80% of the budget is payroll, so it's just, you know, it's invisible. So New York is one of the exceptions. You have payroll information, but I've not seen any city or state that has payroll information to actually have thorough payroll information. There are huge black holes in terms of sick leave, all sorts of extra benefits, other government entities that are contributing to the payroll, so it's not really accurate information. But so the first question is, what do you think about the payroll emissions and the Data Acts and all these other things, and the extraordinary political sensitivity, basically the impossibility of having that as a meaningful part of the discussion in most government units, and even when it is, it's grossly incomplete. And then the second question, I apologize, is we have 80-some-odd thousand government units, and we've been talking about the importance of government-wide standards at the federal level. Well, it's an exponentially more difficult problem at the local level. And it's incredibly empowering for the 15,000 school districts if you can compare the way bankers do the different ratios and expenditures. The current system is so unbelievably bad. It's incredible. I'm a former school board member. I've tried to use a lot of this data, and yet there's no attempt to solve that government-wide problem. I wrote an article about that 5 years ago in Education Week arguing for this case, a Data Act type of proposal, and it's gone nowhere. So how do you address that incredibly difficult but important problem?
I'll try to take the payroll question. In terms of the importance of state and local governments and perhaps even the federal government putting payroll information online, so when it comes to things like should a government's budget and spending be put online, I personally am not willing to say that reasonable people can disagree on it. If you're against that, I don't believe that your opinion is reasonable. However, when it comes to putting names of public employees in the public domain, I am willing to say that reasonable people have different opinions on this issue. In New York City, what we did is the payroll information gets updated within 24 hours. As soon as any one of our 300,000 employees gets paid every other week, the information is there. What we decided to do is to hide the names and put the titles and salaries online. And we had a lot of conversations about it. And again, I believe that reasonable people can disagree on this. That's the route we decided to go. Interestingly, it's all of the names are still subject to freedom of information requests, and there are outside entities that periodically request that data and put it online. But I do believe that payroll information goes and belongs online, but in terms of names, I think that's an outstanding question.
Okay. All right. Hold on one second. I'm going to get a couple more questions. If we keep the questions brief, it allows more time for the panelists to respond. So let's go to the back.
Thank you. My name is Benjamin Herzberg. I'm from the World Bank, and I'm here to hear what's being done in the U.S. at the federal, state level, municipal level to see what the learnings we can take for developing countries, emerging markets. At the state, or especially at the municipal level, I'm really interested as to not only what's the effect of this open data for government efficiencies or municipal government efficiencies, but what's the effect on private sector competitiveness? And what's the bang for the buck in terms not only on the state or the municipality saving some money and being more efficient, but how are people using it? And do you see evidence in your respective states or in others as to the private sector using that open data and the state driving incentives and strategies to really spur up sector growth in those cities? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web, did a big keynote on this. It might have been a TED Talk about the vast potential of what open data can do. But probably the most apparent examples are things that some of the previous speakers talked about. I think about websites like Zillow, which essentially takes MLS, multiple listing service data that used to be only in the hands primarily of realtors, and now it's democratized. Everyone has access to comparable information, price per square foot, estimated, mortgage payment, see the photos, instantaneous access. And then you combine that with another open data source, which is GPS, which originally had military origins, was kind of broken into the public domain after a commercial airliner was shot down, I believe, in Asia. And so then government started to say, okay, well, we need to release GPS data because it's going to protect aircraft. I think the potential is pretty much limitless, but particularly I think that open data has application to the thing that we carry around with us every day, which is your smartphone of some kind, and that people are going to create applications that can profit off of that are the value add. And so one of the large questions for us is, as I've talked about previously, the potential is almost unlimited in terms of what people can profit off of this. The question is, how far does government go into it and kind of preempt the private sector from being part of it? I think that freeing the raw data and making it non-proprietary and not locked in any way and letting people get access to it is the minimum that we should do. And it may be, to some extent, the maximum that we should do, in that we should allow the value-added opportunity to continue to exist for the private sector so that they can go out, create the varied products, and whatever is the most successful, provides the best value, is going to emerge at the top and is going to become the most profitable.
I don't think it's
So, a quick thing is that raw data, what it's trying to basically approximate is the quality of the product that you're looking at. So you mentioned basically police departments, and you said, you know, it's 1,000 for one police department per person and 69 for another one. But we have to basically understand that the quality of the product is inherently subjective. So do we have in mind various methods of measuring that quality?
So with Checkbook NYC as an example, we have to understand that what the trade-off is. If taxpayers want to be able to view data of spending and contracts that is refreshed every 24 hours, which is the case, then the trade-off is that they are viewing unaudited, pre-scrubbed data. Financial transparency, real-time financial transparency, does not in any way, shape, or form replace comprehensive annual financial reports. It simply gives you a good proxy for what is happening today, tomorrow, what happened yesterday, but it doesn't replace it, and that's some of the trade-offs that you need to make with financial transparency.
All right. So I think at this point I've been given the hook, so we're gonna kind of wrap this up. I'd like to thank the panelists for their time this afternoon, and the Data Transparency Coalition for putting on this great conference today. Also remember, you can pick up the copy of your Forrester study, which is pretty cool actually. Just stop by our booth. I won't try to sell you anything. You just pick up the Forrester thing and leave. It'll be good. So, again, thank you for your time. We were excited to be here and appreciate the thoughtfulness of the audience.
Thank you. Thanks to our state and local panel. Now, all day, all of you have been hearing from this stage on the transformation from documents into open data. Next, we have your opportunity to convey your views to the people who are working on these transformations. Let me tell you where our breakout sessions are going to be, because that is not in your program. We are going to end up with this ballroom divided into 3. Salon 1 is already separated from us. This is Salon 2, where I'm standing. And Salon 3 is what will result over there, after this final wall has been closed. In Salon 1, we'll be featuring Christina Ho, who is the Executive Director of Data Transparency for the Treasury Department, in a breakout focusing on federal financial reporting, the accounting, the payments, the budgets, the information that agencies must report to Treasury and OMB. Christina will be handling federal financial reporting in Salon 1. To my right, your left. Here, on this very stage, in this very space, Amy Hazeltine of HHS and Deborah Sonderman of the Department of the Interior will lead a breakout session on grant and contract reporting. Now, it's interesting for you all to understand that grant and contract reporting and federal financial are both within the scope of the Data Act, but until now, they've been separate disciplines. And so we're excited for Amy and Deborah to dig into the specifics of grant and contract reporting here, Salon 2, this space right here. Finally, over in Salon 3, if you are interested in SEC reporting, if you're interested in financial regulation, you are going to want to join Matt Reed. He's the Chief Counsel of the Office of Financial Research, whose role is to promote data standards for financial regulatory reporting. That will be over in Salon 3. Bear with us as we close the hotel, or close the wall. We'll be closing down the hotel later on tonight. And one other thing, if you join one of these sessions, please come up close to the podium and don't hang back over there in the back. At 5 p.m. sharp, we are not going to open the room back up. We will just convene back here in Salon 2 to briefly go over the findings of the breakouts. 5 p.m. sharp. Go thou and do likewise. Enjoy.